So the presentation tonight is kind of a mix of some of the things that I've been working on in the culinary realm, and also the history of foodways along the First Coast. So I like this quote from Emma Bombay. I agree. Oh, it's the wrong direction. I have found that over time, when I was young, I was asked, and I was overweight as a kid, and one of the bullies said to me, "Hey Spear, do you live to eat or do you eat to live?" And I knew that he was just trying to make fun of me, but I didn't understand the difference. Now I do, and I find that living to eat is what I do. It goes into my professional life. And so it's no longer that issue that I had, that insecurity of being out of control or what have you, but it's now a badge of honor. And a lot of people are wearing it these days. It's right here. So the thing that I like about food is that food is a sensuous thing. It's a sensuous category. There's nothing about it that doesn't impact you somehow. All of your senses come into play. You get excited, you salivate, all of this stuff. And so I want you to consider that when you think about things just from your childhood that were these indelible memories, these sensuous experiences. So for me, I remember cotton candies. Like, how did they do that? Or fairy floss, some of you might know that name. Oh, come on. Sorry, my clicker is not, I'm pushing the right button. Or Oreos. Some of you even today may still love them, and do you guys break them apart, or do you bite into them, or what do you do? Okay. Or cup noodles, if you grew up with those. I grew up with Kraft mac and cheese, the blue box. That was my thing. And so I'm wondering, so all of these things, they make these indelible impressions. So I'm wondering, do you have yours? Anything? Okay. So in the meantime, I've been working globally, working in a variety of countries that are considered emerging economies. And I go to these countries and I work with food producers to help them develop brands that are competitive in larger markets. So they're either selling to the US, they're going up into the EU, they're going over into Southeast Asia, to Japan and China, or other markets, they go down to the Middle East and go down to Dubai, because these are more developed markets. And so these are just some of these are the chapters in my current book, My Life of Gluttony, talking about some of the indelible impressions that I had. And so when I was doing all this work, I'm coming home from trips to various places, and my friends were saying, "Hey Jeff, you're having these really cool food experiences. Why don't you write a book?" So I did, but I had to develop a premise, and I said, no, it can't just be about what I'm doing now. It has to be all those indelible impressions starting from when I was a kid. So, in the Boy Scouts, my very first cooking experience, I had to cook to get my badge. And I had a handbook, and in it were a number of recipes, and there was this thing, tuna noodle casserole, and I didn't know what it was. And my mother's a scratch cook, and she never made casserole, she hated them. And I came home from the camping trip and go, "Mom, I just made tuna noodle casserole, it's great." She goes, "Jeffrey, you're never going to have that in this house." But this is just one of those things, it's in the book. I'm from Maryland, so steamed crabs goes without saying.
We're from Maryland.
There are a lot of Marylanders here, I think. But steamed crabs and crab cakes. Trips to New York. I loved going to the soubrette hot dog vendors on the corner. Even now, when I go, if there's a vendor, it has to have a soubrette umbrella. Or Hebrew National if they have them, but hot dogs. I also like corned beef. So, and Jewish style delis are hard to come by these days, and even the ones in New York a lot of them have faded away. So, but corned beef. When I was in Tucson, I went to college at the University of Arizona, and I had a cousin that lived there, my mother's cousin, older guy, because I'm just a kid going to college. And we would go out, he was moonlighting at a liquor store, and I would go out and help him close the place down, and then we'd go out for what he affectionately referred to as coffee and. And he introduced me to biscuits and gravy. Tucson. Oh, come on.
Is that sausage grape?
Yeah,
Is that sausage
yeah,
grape?
sausage grape. In Washington, D.C., it was one of the first places I lived after graduating from school. And mind you, I have no culinary aspirations at this point. This is just stuff that I'm experiencing. And I had flourless chocolate cake. It was to die for. It's still to die for. I have, I think, 4 different recipes that I make that are kind of circle around the concept. In Los Angeles, going to Pink's for chili dogs. If any of you have been to LA and you looked around at street food, one of the things that LA has been known for is chili burgers. You know, and there's always, so there's Tommy's and Tom's and Tony's and all these plays on the same name. But Pink's was chili dogs. And after we were done carousing, so 2, 3 in the morning, we go to Pink's, which is on La Brea Boulevard, and have chili dogs. It's still a wonderful memory. I was assigned to a job in Guyana. Many of the countries I go to they're dangerous for one degree or another because they're unstable or they're just very poor. And so you're not safe walking around. And I was told, don't go out. Just don't go out, period. I read the guidebooks, and there were some things that looked interesting, but it's like I'm either going to lose my phone, I'm going to get hurt, or I'm going to lose my life because I don't need to be a tourist. And so I was stuck in the hotel. But Guyana is one of those places that when I arrived, you know how in the airports you come through customs and all the posters of whatever's local? And I was seeing for the Demerara distillery, this El Dorado rum. And so I sat at the bar, and there was El Dorado, I don't know, El Dorado 5, El Dorado 12, El Dorado 15, and I was sitting at the bar reading, and I'd have one of these, and then the next one, and then the next one, and they go back down. And now I'm an aficionado of rums, of better rums, because of this experience. This is actually a very good rum, by the way. Still is. In Serbia, I had lots of good foods there. Shopska salad. It's cucumbers and tomatoes and cheese and a vinaigrette. And this is what it looks like. Comes to the table. Oh, this is just a wonder for a salad. It's probably the least healthy thing that you can have for a salad, but it's really good. This is not me pushing the wrong button. This is okay. Of all the experiences I've had, this one's the winner. In Malawi, I'm based in the capital city of Lilongwe. There's Lake Malawi, which is this big lake. It's the tourist destination. It's the recreational destination for everyone in the country. And one of my colleagues said, well, you're here, we can't not go. So it's about a 2-hour drive. And so we're driving out. It's a fairly poor country. This is where you still have the huts with the thatched roofs and dirt floors and all that stuff. And we're driving out, and we go through these little commercial districts every now and then. And we were approaching one, and there was some kid out on the street holding the stick. And I didn't know what it was, but we're going 70 miles an hour, and it's like, and I go, oh my God, what was that? And it was like this Tweety and Sylvester thing where it's like, I thought, what is that? Because I was pretty sure they were mice on the stick, but I wasn't quite sure. So we got to another town, and I made a very careful observation. You know, oh my God, I did! And this is what they are. And they catch these mice, and they grill them, and they're dried. They eat them when they're cold, like jerky, the way we eat jerky. There's a recipe for charcoal mouse in my book. It is chicken. In Georgia, the country of Georgia, they have this confectionery. It's made, but they string nuts onto a string, and then they dip it. It's this grape must. It's grape juice and I guess corn flour, maybe. But they make this thick and stuff, and they dip it in like you would make candles. And they're called the Snickers of Georgia. Historically, they've been the high-energy snack bar for centuries. But it's one of the things that's unique to Georgia. All right. Button. Let's try it this way. Come on. There we go. So come here. So, oh, I left them out. Mac and cheese. Look, I grew up, for the longest time when I was a bachelor, I was just going to the grocery store and buying 6, 8, 10 boxes of crab macaroni and cheese at a time. They were a quarter, and then they went up to 35 cents, and I don't even know what they are now. But mac and cheese has always been one of my favorite food groups. So for the Jacksonville chapter, this recipe for killer mac and cheese is in there. If anyone buys a book, I've got a few issues of Jacksonville magazine. It's in the current issue. It's in there too. They just published it. So you get the magazine with the book. I have a few copies. Okay, are you going to cooperate here? So have I got you hungry yet? Okay, so that's the book in general. That's kind of my background. I work with a lot of this stuff. But when I moved here, and I was looking for a story to tell, and I realized that, we hear about, this is called the First Coast, because it's the first place that was settled in North America. And so I decided I'm going to look into the history of what are the foodways here. And so I found out that the earliest evidence of human habitation is 14,000 BC. So the book spans from 14,000 BC to 1821. 1821 was an arbitrary cutoff date. There were enough books post-Civil War and families that had heritage coming back that they wrote books, and I said, I don't need to do that. So I cut off the timeline in 1821. But in this book, going with this range, dealing with the indigenous Indians that were here, the Spanish, the French, the British, and the Africans, and what they brought to this territory. Way back, 14,000 BC, woolly mammoth was a popular food. There were other things, whatever the proteins were of the day. But we jump forward with the indigenous Indians, and they've been around, I think, for about 5,000 years. And they have this one food culture, it's called the Three Sisters, which consists of squash, corn, and beans. That's the core of their diet. And then on top of that, all the seafood is here. So shellfish and shrimp and gator. It's basically all the proteins that are around. Snake, possum, rat. It's interesting, I found a recipe for rat, but it was after 1821. The reference was after 1821, so I couldn't put it in the book. Squirrel, bear, manatee. I mean, they're eating everything that's here. Forget about what we think is cute. That's a contemporary thing. But one of the interesting parts of what they did is they were the original backyard barbecuers. When the Spanish came in 1513 and Juan Ponce de Leon settled in what is now St. Augustine, they brought citrus, so they brought lemons and limes and oranges. They brought pigs, hogs. There was no pork here before the Spanish. They brought bananas. You gotta remember, they were traveling down into Middle and South America and finding all these foods down there. So they brought bananas, they brought sweet potatoes, they brought vanilla, chocolate. None of this stuff was here. Sugar, peaches. One of the things that was interesting about peaches is they were accepted so well by the Indians that people actually thought the Indians had propagated them, and they didn't. Because the Spanish brought it, and then the Indians adopted it as part of their diet. That's part of what the Spanish people did. And we'll get back to that, because keep in mind what that meant to our foodways today. The French came. Now the French along the first coast were unsuccessful. They were very, very poorly provisioned. They didn't know what they were doing. They didn't really have the talents on their ships to be settlers. And so they lived with the Indians and they relied on their foodways, so they indulged in the Three Sisters. They ate bear, they ate alligator. They got to a point where the Indians and the French weren't getting along so well anymore, and they were starving, and the ships that were supposed to come to replenish weren't coming. And so there was one report of having to boil shoe leather. There was another report of trying to cook planks of wood off of their ship to have something to eat. And there was even a report of eating puppies. Yeah. So French, not a real, people talk about all the culinary influence here from the French and their French celebrations, and nah, it wasn't here. It was the French that went in through the Gulf, or the French that came in through other areas, but it wasn't here at that time. The British, however, they were very well provisioned. And they came in up through the north, and then they came down. If you follow the history here, there was this constant shuffle of who owned the land here, who claimed rights to it. And it was the British, and it was the Spanish, and it was the French, and they killed each other, and they went home, and then they came back and said, no, it's fine. And they started killing each other again, and it's a long history. But when the British came, they brought apples, and they brought beef, and they brought white potatoes. The sweet potatoes came in through the Spanish. They brought peas. This is all stuff that we eat today. They brought wheat. Right? Indians had corn, not wheat. They brought peppercorns. And so, this is what the Europeans did. But the Europeans were involved in slave trade, and they had to bring the Africans over on their boats. And the only way that, to help survival on the boats, because you probably all heard stories about people that died on the boats in the horrific conditions and everything. They were trying to feed them the food that they knew, and the Africans wouldn't eat it. And so they said, we have to start putting on the boats foods that they know. So, in order to keep them healthy, this picture is actually makes it look like it wasn't so bad on these boats, but it was pretty bad. But they started carrying peanuts, or ground nuts, they're called over in Africa. I worked over there, and I found out about this thing called ground nuts. They don't call them peanuts. There's probably a different varietal of the nut, but peanuts, watermelon, okra. These are African foods. I remember walking through an African market and seeing big buckets of barrels of okra, and I went, this really is the local stuff. It's pretty cool. And the Africans have, just went blank. They have, it's not sweet potato, and I'm sorry, I went blank on the word, but there are these sweet potato equivalents, but these sweet potatoes, they're huge. And they're not the same thing as the sweet potatoes that we know today. It'll come to me. No. Yams. Yeah, African yams. They're different. Sweet potatoes, they're different. When you see yams in a can, they're sweet potatoes. They're not yams. But these things are huge. There's an African store off of Arlington Expressway that I went into, and they had them. Big pieces of stuff. It's like, oh my God. Anyway, this is a woman holding them in a market. And because they were so enamored with pork that they had access to, a lot of cultures, they eat everything on the animal. And so, for the pork, we talk about how the Africans ate everything from the rooter to the tuber. And they were the people that introduced frying foods. So, if you think about it, with all the stuff that I just showed you, even if you just think about just the things I've shown you, without the Europeans and the African influence here, our foodways would be tremendously different. So, for example, nope, don't get to have one of those, because there's bread made with wheat, there's beef, there's all kinds of stuff in this sandwich that just didn't exist. You don't get this. Ain't gonna happen. No chocolate, no sugar. Or, my experience in Tucson would have been dramatically different. Not gonna happen. And then along with mac and cheese, another one of my favorite food groups is the hot dog. That. No pork, no beef, no white bread rolls. I don't even know about the mustard, forget that. It's just not gonna happen. And then of course the American favorite for many, heritage entirely African. Not gonna happen. So sorry. Again, chocolate, sugar, peanuts. No. And then if you happen to go along with your Big Mac if you want, you don't get these either, because we wouldn't have these without the British. So, again, No ice cream. Because there was no milk, no cow's milk, no sugar, no chocolate. Some of the fruit wasn't here, so none of that stuff was possible. We couldn't make it. Plus, they didn't have refrigeration, so that's a whole other story. Now, you could have had a backyard barbecue, because the Indians taught us about that, but no sausages of any sort. And then when you get down to kind of pure Americana, all of this stuff, no apple pie. You know, you might have the mom and the girl next door, but no apple pie. And then Thanksgiving, think about it. Just forget about it. Not gonna happen. So, when you think about what was happening through this period from, let's just say from 1513 until, if you want to use my date of 1821, but still the first few hundred years of European settlement here, so much changed. And you know, from the indigenous population's perspective, all the peace and prosperity they had for 5,000 years, gone. This happens in a lot of cultures where the Europeans came and took over, and happened in Australia, happens in a lot of places. But, you know, we're left with this idea of, well, can I have some more? So, in the First Coast Heritage book, it's out of print now, but one of the recipes was bearhead hash. This is a recipe that is derived from what the Indians, the indigenous populations, were eating. They would take the bear head, now mind you, they're eating everything that the animal has to offer. And so they would boil the bear head, strip off the meat. You probably heard people doing stuff like this. You know, a lot of chefs. I think Anthony Bourdain was a big advocate of this sort of stuff. It was veal cheeks, and I don't know what else. But anyway, it was the meat stripped off of a bear's head, mixed with onions and some veggies, and basically it's corned beef hash, if you think about the bear. So the recipe that I've got in the book, it just says you can use any kind of leftover meat. Now, when I was cooking this up for the photo, I just went over to Publix and got a big old slab of corned beef and chopped it up, or roast beef, and put it in there. And so, when did you say the book's coming out in May?
Hopefully May, yeah.
Yeah, so when it comes out, these recipes, including bearhead hash, will be in there. And then, killer mac and cheese. I was asked the other day, what makes it killer? And I said, it's the volume of cheese. I've been playing around with macaroni and cheese for years now, trying to find really the ultimate. And for a long time I thought this was the ultimate. And lately when I'm making it, I don't know what's varying, because I don't follow the recipe per se, I just kind of, I know what's in it. And I don't know if it's the cheddar that I'm using that changes, or now that there's Parmesan in it, there's mascarpone. I'm now thinking about throwing in some Gruyere, throwing in more Parmesan, throwing in better, extra sharp cheddar. But anyway, the recipe's in the Gluttony book, and it's in Jacksonville magazine. So, and Jacksonville magazine's online, so if you don't want to get the magazine and you don't want to get the book, you can just pull it off their website. JacksonvilleMag.com. So, and for locals, it's available at the book line. And it's also available on Amazon, but I'll let you try business locally. So, go to the book line, tell Romy you saw me. Suggest a few copies there. So, I like to bring up this quote. Kevin James has one that I like too. It says, "There's nothing so satisfying as a warm pizza box on your lap." But I thought this one is like, how true, you know what's going to happen. You know, why did I pass it? Anyway, we have time for questions, but thank you very much.
In the 1700s, just before this period.
Sorry?
What did they eat in the late 1700s before 1821?
Well, that's all, you know, that's the various foods that the Spanish, the French, and the Spanish and the British brought, plus the foods that the Indians were providing. You know, when the settlers, explorers, conquerors, whatever you want to call them, you have a choice. Depends on your perspective. The Indians would not speak too fondly of them. You know, they weren't that well prepared. They did have certain provisions that they brought. But the local food. I remember reading about the history of Australia, and the British were over there trying to settle, and the local Aboriginals were eating fish. There was so much fish coming out of the ocean. Well, for the British, this was peasant food. It was beneath them. And so the British were starving because they wouldn't accept the Aboriginal way. Here, there was more cooperation. If you read history books, you find that sometimes they were friendly, and then politics changed and they weren't, and the Indians said, no, the hell with you. But all of these foods were popular and possible. I read a lot of books, a lot of history books, and I'm just skimming through them, and I'm looking for mention of food. And then I would look for the history of those foods to find out where did they come from. How did the governor have a dinner here? Now we're talking about settlement times. How did the governor have a fancy dinner? Where did these foods come from? And if I couldn't find enough attribution saying that it came from, it was either locally grown or who brought it in, then it didn't go in the book. I found a really cool mention of a marigold sauce made with marigold flowers. I could not find a second mention of it. And so without repetition, you don't really know if it's an error or just there's no repetition. However, having worked in Georgia, in the country of Georgia, they call it zafran, and it's a yellow powder, and it's not saffron, it's marigold leaves. And so, because I now cook Georgian food, there's Georgian in my book, I now have a stock of saffron at home. And it's like, damn, if I had that when I was writing the book, I might have been able to find a way to include it. But, yeah.
So I was surprised at the Thanksgiving one. Turkeys are not indigenous?
They may have been here, but I didn't find any mention of anyone eating them. Someone asked me, when that book came out, someone asked me, what about chickens? And what I learned, I had to go back and research that one. I couldn't answer the question on the night of the question. Couldn't answer the question on that night. And it turned out that chickens were used for laying eggs. They weren't eating the chickens. So we didn't find that in the diet. I didn't find any mention of turkey, although they're here. So they must have eaten them, they just didn't make it into the books. So again, if I'm going to be accurate with my research, if it's not being mentioned with enough multiple occasions, not going to say that it was there. Not going to make the assumption.
Do you have any examples of any reverse influence? So foods that might have been brought over from Europe that Native Americans adopted and incorporated into the
But peaches is probably the biggest one. That one, because they started cultivating it, and so people were coming later, and they thought that these orchards, these peach orchards, were the Indians doing, and they weren't. What I find interesting is the way peanuts in this country have taken off. Peanut butter, you go anywhere overseas, you go in the grocery store, in the grocery stores here, you go down in the jelly aisle, and there's the peanut butter, and there's all this peanut butter, right? Florida stealing peanut butter. Jif, Skippy, whatever brand you like. And then you might find maybe a couple of facings of Vegemite or Marmite, depending on what brand it is, but just a couple. You go over to Europe, you go into Australia, and you go into the grocery store, and there's all this Vegemite and all this Marmite, and you might be lucky if you find 1 or 2 jars of peanut butter. And people I talk to, I say, what about peanut butter? They go, yeah. And they say, Jeff, Vegemite, and I go, yeah. So. Anybody else?
So is it Vegemite and jelly?
They eat. So I was married to an Australian. And it was really the only time that if she got close to me once she'd be eating, I said, get away. I wasn't quite that polite. But what they take just a little bit and they scrape it onto bread or onto toast or onto a cracker. A real thin layer. It's very salty. It's a yeast spread. It's really salty. It's really nasty. But, try it. But if you eat it, really scrape it thin.
And then brush your teeth.
Well,
Nothing else with Vegemite.
Yeah.
Just Vegemite.
it's like, for it's like when my cat comes, would come in and would have a mouse in its mouth. And then we get the mouse out of the house, and then he'd come up and he'd want cuddles, and I go, get that face away from him. And the same thing when that's not why we got divorced, but I don't miss having her come close to me with that mouth after eating Vegemite. Yeah.
I've always heard the first flavor of ice cream is tomato.
Oh, I've never heard that. Yeah, that I don't know, because ice cream
Tomato is a fruit.
Yeah. Look,
Interesting.
whether it was the first flavor or not, I don't know. I would, if you think about the origins of chocolate and how it spread, the Spanish were finding it down in, I think it was in the Aztec communities, and they were taking it back to Europe, and it became a lot of things like peppercorns, and became one of the foods of the wealthy. And they were drinking chocolate. And it was bitter, they weren't putting sugar in it at the time. But it was one of the things. Then when sugar became popular, interesting anecdote is that it was the food of the wealthy. Yeah. And so, remember, hygiene back then wasn't great. You have to remember that back then, people didn't drink water because they didn't understand the bacteria in the water. And so they were drinking beer because it was cooked and there was nothing in there. I still to this day can't quite understand how anybody got anything done when beer and spirits were the beverage of choice. What's that?
They didn't get it done.
Yeah, but anyway, one of the marks of the wealthy, because they were eating the sugar because they could, is their teeth were rotten. And it became trendy for people that if they couldn't afford sugar, they would blacken their teeth to imply that they were of that class. It's like no different than, I don't know when it started, but when the wealthy were taking vacations to tropical locations and coming home with a tan, and tanning became this thing that, it's a mark of wealth. I mean, there's a place up the street here on A1A. It's called Tan Like a Celebrity. And it's like, what does that mean? Anyway, yeah.
One of the indigenous foods that I think for anybody and everybody that lives in this community for a long time is heart of palm.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Palm trees.
Absolutely. Yeah. One of the recipes in the book is what is it? A swamp cabbage salad. It's called swamp cabbage, and it's the heart of the palm. The Indians ate that, and but when they would harvest the heart, it killed the tree. And so now the majority of hearts of palm come from South America. And I remember working with a company down in, I think it was in Ecuador. And they're, oh, you're the company that sells all the hearts of palm up here in America. Yeah, thank you.
So you mentioned, how the Europeans drink beer and they drink water, but are there any other drinks that might have been shared between, like you mentioned as a foodway, but were there drinks like the Timucuans had the black drink?
Yeah, that's the only one I know of. There was this black tea, and apparently very bitter, and I think it was more ceremonial than beverage. But I didn't come across, I wasn't looking, let me read this. When I was doing the research, I was looking for the stuff that came up repetitively and could be verified. And so I didn't, there was, what was it? There was a drink that the British had, it's called Syllabub. And it was, I made it, it's actually not too bad, it sounds disgusting. It didn't go in the book because it was just too weird. But I think it was wine and cream and sugar, I think. It was a very weird drink. But, if you can find a recipe for it, it'd be worth trying. It's like hardtack, you know about hardtack? Hardtack were these biscuits, flour and water made into biscuits. And they were hard, but they could travel, they didn't spoil. And so this was the food that they had on the ships. So when all the other provisions were gone, all they had left was hardtack. But that's how they survived.
What about juice from all the fruits they brought over?
If they were juicing, I found nothing. It wouldn't surprise me, but I mean, the juice culture that we know today is a contemporary thing. Also, you have to remember that tools were limited, and so they considering that beer and distilled spirits were the beverage of choice, I don't know that they gave it much thought. A lot of the reasons that juice has become so popular is for health reasons. And it's, we understand nutrients and we understand, the kind of flavorful refreshment and all of that. But back then, one of the things I find when I travel, now mind you, I got my culinary credentials when I was in my 30s. So some of my travel was before I really knew what I was talking about. It was stuff I like to eat. But as I got the culinary credentials, and I'm traveling in some of these places where people are surviving. These are countries where they talk about food security, meaning do they have enough food to get through the year until the next harvest comes? And so food in these places is a matter of survival. It's a matter of nutrition and sustenance. It is not for pleasure. And here I am, kind of drooling over something. Oh, what is this? And I still remember I was in Niger. I think it's in the book, in the African chapter. These skewered beef. And the hotel that I was staying at was one of two hotels that catered to Westerners. And they had a barbecue pit out by the pool, and there was a bar there. And so at the end of the day, you could sit outside and have a drink and have these skewered cubes, these beef cubes. They were fabulous. And I'm trying to find out from these Africans, what is this? How did you make it? And they're looking at me like I'm an idiot, because for them, food, they don't understand. They're just trying to get by. And so I managed to get enough information together to piece the recipe together. But a lot of times I just don't know. Anything else? No? So speaking of beer and spirits, there's drinks over there. I thank you all for coming.